This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 343, entitled Masculism's Main Political Goals. Description. This flyer lists the main political goals of the Masculists, such as the FIPing of women, the freeing of men from female manslavery, giving men the intellectual tools to hit back at the hated feminazis, pushing for the menfairing of the gender laws, bringing in the paternity, rejection rate, etc. There are 10 items on this list, which could have been far longer. For itself. Masculism's Main Political Goals by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer lists and elaborates on the major goals of the Masculist movement. Masculism has many goals, but I'll give only a handful, that is 10, here, so as to keep the size of this flyer to a reasonable length. They are the most important goals that nearly all Masculists of various shades want to see achieved. I'll begin by listing them in a bulleted form and will then elaborate on them later. Here's a list of what the Masculists really want to achieve in political terms. 1. The liberation of men from female manslavery by the FIPing of women. 2. The menfairing of the gender laws, especially in the divorce courts, and the legislation of the paternity rejection rate. 3. The education of men in Western countries of the toxicity of divorce and hence marriage, pushing them not to marry, not to be fathers. 4. Putting strong moral pressure on young women to FIP up or be punished by not getting a man. 5. Giving men masculist intellectual tools to hit back at the female chauvinism of monoconscious feminism. 6. Restoring men's self-image by using science to prove that men are the superior sex. 7. Pushing society to become bi-conscious so that whole populations don't get wiped out. 8. Restoring the gender political pendulum so that society can heal from the wounds inflicted by monoconscious feminism. 9. Setting up masculist groups in every high school and university. 10. Making masculism as big as feminism, telling the other half of the gender story. There are many other goals of the Masculists that I could mention. I have made nearly 350 videos on masculist themes at the time of the writing of this flyer, so there are plenty of other topics that could be added to the above list. I now elaborate on the above list, item by item, below. 1. The liberation of men from female manslavery by the FIPing of women. Explicit in the very title of my book on masculism is the idea that men need to be liberated from female manslavery. The book's title is Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, an e-textbook of 300 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Masculism is men's lib. Monoconscious feminists, that is, who have only had their feminist consciousness raised and not their masculist consciousness, will probably scoff at the idea of men's lib with quips such as, "What do men have to be liberated from?" The fact that feminists tend to react this way shows how deeply ignorant they are of how women oppress men. For example, with women's financial parasitism of men, women's manslavery, the fluffy feminist hypocrisy in the divorce courts that they have taken over, women's red pill nature, that is, not loving men for themselves, but only as sexploitable cash machines, who are only loved by women if men are useful to women, otherwise dumped in favour of a more sexploitable man. It's men who have liberated women, that is, from female household drudgery, by giving women household gadgets, higher education, the contraceptive pill, probably the greatest social revolution in history, modern medicine, a female life expectancy into the 80s, etc. Thanks to the pill, women now routinely have 0, 1 or 2 kids, but live into their 80s. So even those women who have their 2 kids, so as not to contribute to the crash of whole populations, still have a career window of some half a century, so that men can be freed from manslavery by not having to work for a woman for most of his life. Masculism is men's lib in the sense of freeing men from being slaves to women, working for women, so that a woman can stay at home in a house that her husband pays for, keeping her and her kids financially afloat, since it is almost impossible for a woman to have a full-time career and be a mother of small children at the same time. The Masculists tell women, quote, "Now that women can work, they must work. Anything else is parasitism of the labour of men." So women have to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, a very important concept for the Masculists, meaning financially independent persons, or be punished by men by not getting one. Masculists make a historical analogy between the Negro slavery in the US in the 1800s and manslavery in the 2000s. The abolitionists of the 1800s in the US wanted to abolish Negro slavery, which they saw as a moral abomination. The Masculists of the 2000s want to abolish manslavery, which they see as a moral abomination, by forcing women to FIP up, by bothering to get a career-competent education at high school and college. There's a long way to go, because in practice, in most Western countries, 3/4 of young women at age 16 choose to become what the Masculists call fluffy crappers. That is, studying fluffy crap. That is the soft option, the intellectually easy, intellectually lazy option of memory-based majors instead of analytically based majors such as math and the sciences, which would give them diplomas and skills that the economy values and pays well for. So that these future fluffies, a Masculist term for a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money of a man, end up becoming fluffy parasites as adults, and hence hated and subsequently punished by the Masculists. Fluffies are vermin to Masculists. They are seen by Masculists as being immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin to be wiped out by being totally ignored by men, not even pumped and dumped, forcing their fluffy parasite genes to be removed from the gene pool by being totally ignored, rotting on the shelf, utterly rejected by men who treat them as vermin to be spat at. Thus, the rise of masculism is a major historical shift in gender roles. You could argue that the core idea of masculism is that, quote, "Now that women can work, they must work." By establishing a masculist group in every high school, Masculists can apply strong moral pressure on young women to FIP up or pay a very heavy price of not getting a man, hence will become manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and as Masculist ideas spread throughout the world, spat at for being hated, manslaving, fluffy vermin. Masculists hate fluffies. 2. The menfairing of the gender laws, especially in the divorce courts, and the legislation of the paternity, rejection, right. Masculists have an even stronger hatred of the so-called fluffy feminist hypocrites who have taken over the divorce courts, making them so toxic for men that in many countries now, 2/3 of young men under 35 refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves. That is, they have gone MGTOW, men going their own way, an important branch of the men's lib movement. And in parentheses, the main difference between the Masculists and the MGTOWs is that the latter are apolitical, passive, who quietly walk away from marriage and paternity, preferring to devote their money and time on themselves rather than being a manslave to a female, and facing a 1 chance in 4 of being financially massacred and having his life ruined as a father in a fluffy feminist hypocrite-dominated divorce court system. This 1 in 4 chance is so odious to men, such a shitty deal, that young men in their millions are wiping their hands of marriage. If the gender laws are not soon menfaired, then probably within a decade, the percentage of young men rejecting marriage and paternity will be over 90%, which will be a catastrophe because it implies that whole populations get wiped out within a mere generation. Thus the masculists, who are a lot more political and confrontational than the passively wimpy MGTOWs, see the fluffy feminist hypocrites who control the divorce courts as indirect genociders, so have to be stopped. These fluffy feminists are seen by the masculists as being hypocrites because these women behave as feminists in the parliaments, pushing for equal rights for women, but behave as traditional fluffies in the divorce courts, expecting to treat men as traditional cash machines, expected to pay for women, so that these divorcing fluffy feminists can keep their cake and eat it too. They want to have equal rights with men, but reject equal obligations with men, that is, sharing equally the burden of earning the living, by bothering to FIP up and pull their financial weight, by getting a career-competent education and becoming FIPs as adults, not expecting to parasite off the money and labour of a man. For masculists, it's bad enough that these divorcing women are fluffies, but they're also feminists, and hence real hypocrites. So the masculists are pushing hard for the reform of the divorce courts. Otherwise, young men will wipe out whole populations by rejecting paternity in ever-growing numbers. The masculists argue, however, that men are merely reacting to the toxicity of the divorce courts as taken over by the fluffy feminist hypocrites, making marriage such a shitty deal for men that most thinking men wash their hands of it. In today's Western countries, a divorcing father will lose his kids with a 90% probability, which are odds so high that any thinking man will argue that it is not worth the risk to have kids at all. He will lose his house so that his ex-wife can raise her kids in it. He will lose half his stuff to her. He will be forced to pay her child support for kids he will barely see. If the ex-wife is a real fluffy, he often has to pay alimony to her for the rest of his life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up, so that she remains parasiting off his money after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. The financial parasitism of fluffies is one of the main reasons why masculists say that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, because female oppression of men is so sustained, so deep, lasting decades. Masculists push for the FIPing of women for many reasons. If nearly all women were real FIPs, then it would be much easier for masculists to achieve one of their major political goals, that is the legislation of the paternity rejection right, the lack of which is in today's world is the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists, and it's not against women but against men. Women have had the maternity rejection right, aka that's also known as abortion right, since the 70s in many countries, but men have no such right, even today. Women have the right to reject an unwanted pregnancy that they claim would screw up their lives, but men don't have the equivalent right. So millions of women lie to their boyfriends/husbands that they are on the pill, get pregnant, then expect their men to pay for babies that the men never wanted in the first place. This is a blatant example of the type of gender crimes that women commit daily against men, reinforcing the idea that women oppress men more than vice versa, but one needs to have one's masculinist consciousness raised to see that. With nearly all women FIPs, the para could be brought in much more easily, because a woman who gets sole custody of the kids after a divorce could afford to pay for them. However, since research shows that single mothers make poor parents, with the children much more likely to suffer from problems such as alcoholism, teenage pregnancy, dropping out of high school, drugs, depression, etc. It's better for the kids to have joint custody of the kids, by default after a divorce. Masculists teach women that kids are not the property of females. Half the DNA in children is from the father. 3. The education of men in Western countries of the toxicity of divorce and hence marriage, pushing them not to marry, not to be fathers. At the time of writing, April 2019, most men, and most women too, are not yet aware of masculist ideas, so the masculists face a huge task of educating the public, especially men, about how toxic the fluffy feminist hypocrites have made divorce. So advise young men not to marry, not to have kids, until the gender laws are menfaired, as in the previous point. Today's marriage is such a shitty deal for men that all men in Western countries ought to know this, so that they can reject marriage and paternity, thus putting enormous pressure on the gender politicians to menfair the gender laws, or society, that is both sexes, will start assassinating them for not doing so. Men will hate the gender politicians for abusing men so badly in terms of the unfairness of the gender laws, and women, especially young women, will also hate them because young women will not be able to have babies because young men will continue to refuse to give them their sperm due to the toxicity of the divorce courts taken over by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites. Masculists will harangue young men saying to them, "Don't be a fool, don't marry, don't have kids, don't take the risk of 1 chance in 4 of being financially crucified and having your life ruined in a fluffy feminist-dominated divorce court system. Go MGTOW. Spend your money on yourself. Don't be a manslave to a fluffy parasite. Put moral pressure on fluffies to FIP up or force them to rot on the shelf. A fluffy can only be a fluffy if she can get her claws, her financial claws, into some gullible manslave. But thanks to the masculists and the MGTOWs, the supply of such gullible manslaves is drying up. Don't ruin your life by being a dumb, ignorant, gullible manslave. Liberate yourself, be masculist, and fight for the menfairing of the gender laws. Otherwise, whole populations will get wiped out." 4. Putting strong moral pressure on young women to FIP up or be punished by not getting a man. Masculists are very political. They aim to create masculist groups in every high school, every college, every university. They aim to create men's studies courses, push professors to write textbooks on men's issues, etc. Masculists direct a lot of energy to the FIPing of women, since so many of men's gender issues will be solved once nearly all women have FIPed up. Men will be freed from manslavery. Once the divorce courts have been reformed so that divorce is no longer a financial catastrophe for men, once custody of kids after a divorce is joint by default, once alimony has been thrown out, etc., then men will be much more willing to be fathers again. If women are FIPs, then it will be much less burdensome and much less risky for a man to marry and be a father. Many men want to be fathers, but don't dare to in today's world, because the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites have taken over the divorce courts, seeing men as cash machines to be robbed, abused and exploited. Fluffies will become increasingly less tolerated as masculist ideas spread throughout the world. Young men at high school will put enormous moral pressure on young women to study career-competent majors so that they do not expect to become fluffies as adults and hence pay a heavy price of being manless. Young men will imbibe masculist slogans, hurling abuse at young fluffies who choose to study fluffy crap majors, making them fluffy crappers in these young men's eyes. Young women will be socially and sexually rejected for not fipping up, paying a heavy price that the masculisted young men will force on them, treating such women as vermin, as hated, to be spat at. 5. Giving men masculist intellectual tools to hit back at the female chauvinism of monoconscious feminism. Universities are now very unpleasant places to be for young men, because in many of them, 2/3 of the students are female, who have had their feminist consciousnesses raised, but who know nothing about masculism, who have not had their masculist consciousnesses raised, so are, by definition, monoconscious. That is, they are not bi-conscious. That is, they have not had both their feminist and their masculist consciousnesses raised, so are gender-biased, anger-biased, being angry at men for the way men oppress women, but knowing nothing about the reverse case, because most women and most feminists haven't even heard of the label masculist and masculism. They haven't the first clue what the masculists are talking about. So when men do learn about masculism, it can come as a real cathartic experience for them, giving them the intellectual tools to hold their own against feminazi harangues against men. These freshly emasculisted men can then harangue back with masculist ideas, telling these university feminists that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, and that if a feminist does not become bi-conscious, then she will be seen increasingly as being a bigot. These university masculists can tell women that if they're not bi-conscious, then they risk not getting a man, because monoconscious feminists tend to be feminazi bitchy towards men, and hence much less likely to have a boyfriend, since men reject misandrous male-dumping feminazi bitches like the plague, forcing these monoconscious feminazis to rot on the shelf, manless, babyless, who then become increasingly bitter later in life, when they feel that they have missed out on life, as they have. Masculism preaches/teaches to men that men are the superior sex, based on the scientific evidence. For example, men are smarter than women by about 4 IQ points. YouTube Prof Rushton, R-U-S-H-T-O-N, or Prof Lynn, L-Y-N-N, on this. That men have a 10% higher IQ variance than women, so that the morons and the genii are males, so that men have won 99% of the Science Nobel Prizes, that women have 10% smaller brains than men due to women's hypergamy, that is, the female instinct to mate with a superior male to get his superior DNA for her kid, so that her kid has superior DNA to hers, and that's good for the species, so was inherited. Thus the patriarchy, that is, general male dominance across the board, is a side effect of women's sexual preference for men who were taller, bigger, stronger, fiercer and smarter than they were, so were more able to protect her against other males, and being smarter made better hunters, who brought back the bacon with higher probability for her and her kids, who kept her at home and not running around chasing game far from the home cave. Masculism gives men a type of religion that allows them to increase their sense of self-worth. They are better able to reject the feminazi claim that men are toxic, when in reality it is women who are massively immoral, parasiting off the labour of men. 6. Restoring men's self-image by using science to prove that men are the superior sex. One of the superior aspects of masculism compared to feminism is its much greater reliance on science to back up its claims, whereas most feminists are is-cyanate fairies, in brackets. Is-cyanate equals unable to reason scientifically due to ignorance of science, and fairy equals living in a fairyland, believing whatever you want to believe without evidence, hence being no better than a religionist, a flat earther, or creationist. Since masculism is more science-based, it is stronger than feminism, and this fact can be used to great effect by men when hurling back abuse at the feminazis, intellectually crushing them with science-based facts concerning women's genetic inferiority